egg timer. Every book that I've ever written, indeed every story that I've ever tried to tell, involves some sort of journey, and always actually a personal journey as well as a geographical journey. And I thought that it might be different for Chanel, because she is, after all, a kind of quintessential French woman, and what could I, as a mere English woman, bring to the story? But actually, there was a real English connection, which I'm going to come to. But it started, for me, in Chanel's private apartment in Rue Cambon, above the boutique. And it's this incredible place that feels haunted, not in a sort of terrifying way, but if buildings contain the fabric of the past and the voices and the footsteps of people that have walked through them, then Chanel's private apartment certainly contains those things. This is her writing desk, and I sat and wrote some of the book at this desk. And there, to my amazement, I found those set of tarot cards. She was a real believer in magical thinking. And the picture of Chanel as a young woman in that classic kind of stripy sailor's top, her sunglasses and her fan. Can we have the next slide? It was also there that I noticed the chandelier. It was a chandelier of her own design. And the kind of iconography of Coco Chanel is fascinating. Everything that she ever designed or made contains with it a clue to her very, very mysterious past. She was a woman that totally reinvented herself and spent decades covering up her tracks. I've always thought that fashion and what we wear is not just about the surface of things, it's about what we cover up. And in telling the story of a woman like Chanel, for me, it was a process of uncovering something of this very mysterious woman and trying to get to the heart of the matter. But in this chandelier, it took me a few times of being in the apartment before I actually noticed the number 5 that is hidden within the wrought iron design. Also the G for Gabrielle, which was her given name, the name that she was christened with, and the camellias that were such an important part of her style. Can we have the next one? This was Chanel lying on the sofa in her private apartment, and I actually fell asleep on this sofa when I was there working in the apartment. I didn't go into a sort of deep sleep, but it was very, very late at night, and I'd been working and working and working, and everyone else from the house of Chanel had left, and this was the most atmospheric time to write. There was just a security guard left downstairs, and there I was alone in this huge building. But I, at that moment, realized why it was that Chanel rather famously didn't have a bedroom in her private apartment. She slept across the road at the Ritz. Well, wouldn't we all sleep at the Ritz if we could? In fact, I got so obsessed while I was writing this book that I did indeed go through the archives of the Ritz and found out which bedroom it was that Chanel slept in. And it's not the Coco Chanel suite that is sold for $25,000 a night, which rather to my relief, because I wanted to sleep in the room that Chanel lived and died in. And I did finally track it down, and rather wonderfully, it's probably the least expensive room in the house. But while I was alone in this apartment, thinking about the ghosts of what had once been there, and sometimes because there's so many mirrors in the apartment, and also the famous mirrored staircase that leads up to the apartment, I had this sense that if I just could turn my head fast enough, I might see a reflection of Chanel herself. And eventually, I was so sort of tired and overwrought that I did put my feet up on the settee and took my shoes off, I hasten to add. But I felt at that moment that sort of veil between the past and the present, the living and the dead, came apart just for a second. And those are those seconds that every writer seeks. I think it was Margaret Atwood that said that every book is a conversation with the dead, and it certainly is for me. Can we move on? I also went to the convent where Chanel was brought up as a child. She was abandoned after the death of her mother by her father, along with her two sisters. And it's an incredibly remote place in south-central France called Aubezine. It was a 12th century monastery where Cistercian monks had lived. And then by the time Chanel ended up there in the late 19th century, because this is a woman whose life spanned a century and really is the life of a century. But when she went to live there as a child, the monks had gone, but an order of nuns was there. And the orphanage is long gone, but a handful of nuns still remain. And they're a more or less silent order, and they've never allowed a writer, a journalist, anyone who has any interest in Chanel to go and visit them before, let alone stay with them, because their mind is on other less worldly things. But I wrote to them, because obviously you can't phone a silent order, and asked if I could come, and, you know, the answer came there, none. And then I kept writing, and eventually the Mother Superior decided that yes, I could, because the day that I'd asked, suggested as an arrival date, was in fact the Saint's Day of Saint Justine, so she thought that, you know, it was a sign. And it was very, very remarkable place to be. It's the coldest place that I've ever been. I was there at this time of year, and the end of February, and it was freezing, no hot water, no central heating. But there, within the monastery, you see again, as much as the number 5 in the Chandelier and the kind of glorious mirror-clad apartment of Chanel in Paris, you see different clues. And for me, one of the most striking was this stained glass window. There's no figurative stained glass in a Cistercian monastery, but they have these geometric patterns, and I was immediately struck by the similarity to that famous interlocked double C logo, which is still the symbol of Chanel throughout the world, one of the most instantly recognizable logos throughout the world. And there it is from its medieval past. Can we move on? The other thing that I was very struck by and proved to be a really significant part of this journey was this staircase in the corner of the Abbey at Aubezine. And I was just sitting there at dusk one evening, sort of longing, really, for a sign, for a clue, for something, and also thinking, I didn't feel, what am I doing here? But it came at a very traumatic time in my own life. This journey to Aubezine, to the convent, coincided with the end of my marriage. So I was feeling very, very lost. And I think it's in that place, that internal landscape, that sometimes as a writer, you are at your most open, when you are at your most raw. And so I was sitting in the church, and suddenly, as my eyes became accustomed to the darkness, I saw this staircase in the corner, and I walked up those stairs, and at the top there was a very heavy oak door, and it was absolutely in complete darkness, and I pushed at the door, and there, if we move to the next slide, I came onto a corridor, and it was a mosaic corridor, and there, in the thousands of pebbles that had been laid by the medieval monks were these stars. There were stars and moons and strange sort of hieroglyphics, but the star really, really struck me because it is the 5-sided star that appears over and over again in Chanel's jewelry and in her designs, and seeing it there on the corridor that she would have walked along over and over again as a child, from matins in the morning all the way through Evensong at Night, it seemed to me that this was one of the clues I'd been searching for. Can we move on? As I said at the beginning, I spent a long time researching and writing this book. It really goes all the way back to the late 90s, which was the first time I went to Chanel's apartment and the first time I met Karl Lagerfeld. And for a long time I felt that although I wanted to write this book, that I couldn't, as an English woman, take on this, the most famous of French couturiers. And then I realized in the course of finding out more about Chanel that the English did play a tremendously important part. The two great loves of her life were both Englishmen. The first was Boy Capel, who was the man that put her into business, gave her the money to set up in 1910. And the second love of her life was the Duke of Westminster, who we can see in this picture here. And it was one of the most exciting moments for me, really, as a writer, when I discovered the private archive where there were pictures from the late 1920s of Chanel that had never been seen before with the Duke of Westminster. And this was one of them. And it really is Chanel as I had never seen before, and certainly really a lost and forgotten Chanel. She's there just in those sort of the clothes that she made famous, which are the loose, fluid cardigans, the skirts. It's kind of practicality that was crucial to her as a designer. She was the first designer to take away corsets, to design clothes that women could run in, could work in the First World War, could dance in the 1920s. But it was through these pictures that I found in the Westminster archive that I realized how English tweeds, English sort of sporting garb, masculine clothes that would have been the Duke of Westminster's own wardrobe, she then incorporated into her own aesthetic. And if anybody, now buys or wears a Chanel jacket, or the many copies of them that are made, the very best, the real thing, will still be made out of Scottish tweed. Can we move? This is Chanel with Winston Churchill, and absolutely a wonderful picture, again a picture that had never been seen before, and which I found in another private archive. And one of the things that people always say when they find out that I've been working on a book about Chanel is it true, was she a Nazi? And I felt that telling the story of Chanel's Second World War was absolutely crucial. But interestingly, the clues to the reality of what happened in the Second World War I found in this country, in the Churchill archives in Cambridge. And the archives, obviously, those Churchill archives have been thoroughly trawled before, but always by male, often military historians. And, and I obviously worship at their shrine, but no one had ever been interested in what might turn up of Chanel there. Literally, the head of the archives there, when I got in touch and said, can I have a look, said, well, what would Coco Chanel be doing here? And I said, well, she had a long-term relationship with the Duke of Westminster, and the Duke of Westminster was one of Churchill's oldest friends, so let me look. And there indeed were pictures, and also, if we move on to the next slide, this absolutely crucial letter which no one had ever seen before, which is one of the letters that Chanel wrote to Churchill during the Second World War. She became involved in a story of such complex double agents, triple agents. It's like The Third Man. I mean, it's like a Graham Greene novel. But suffice to say, it's far more fascinating, far more complicated than the myth of Chanel's Second World War. And there, in, of all places, you know, an archive in Cambridge, were these letters. If we move on, I don't know if we've got to my 2 minutes yet. This is my last story in what is many, many, many stories. Chanel was a storyteller as well as a fashion designer. And one of the last places I went to while researching the book was to see and then to stay with her last surviving relative. I can't tell you the whole story because I'm running out of time, but a woman who is now in her 80s called Gabrielle, and who is officially Chanel's great niece, but in fact, as I discovered, may well be her granddaughter, the daughter of Chanel's possibly son, but certainly officially nephew. And once I'd got to know her, and it took several meetings, she said, and I was staying the night, and before I went to bed, she said, follow me along the corridor, and she lives alone in an old manor house. And there, in a bedroom, was a wardrobe. And I was always obsessed with Narnia as a child, and used to spend a lot of time sitting inside the wardrobe, hoping to go through to the other side. And this is the closest I think I've ever come to the magic of that childhood reading, which was Gabrielle, the younger, said, open the wardrobe. And I opened the wardrobe, and there were all of Chanel's own couture clothes that had been made and that she wore herself. And Gabrielle said to me, go on, try them on. And I said, I can't. And she said, well, you must, otherwise you won't understand the real Coco Chanel. So I put on a jacket, and it fitted beautifully. It did all the things that a Chanel jacket does, which makes your arms look longer and makes you look like you've got a waist, even, you know, if you're straight up and down like I am. And I put my hands into the pocket because Chanel always believed that every pocket should be there, you know, to put your hands in. They've got to be useful, just like every buttonhole must have a button. So I put my hands into the pocket, and there was a white handkerchief and a pair of gloves, and they still smelt of Chanel No. 5. And I think that's 15 minutes.